Hello and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy and it's Wednesday the 18th of October. I'm joined here in the studio today by Professor John Robertson. Hello John, how are you doing?
I'm well.
Yeah,
Yourself?
good to hear that. So,
Good.
John, you're a lecturer, or you were a lecturer and teacher for more than 20 years. You've now retired. You were a professor at the University of the West of Scotland. You founded the excellent Talking Up Scotland 2 blog site, which I would thoroughly recommend. And you were telling us earlier that it's won an Oliver Brown Award. So, congratulations on that. And you're a regular contributor to Broadcasting at Scotland, for which we thank you. So, thank you again.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
It's good to have you. So I'll start today's show with our sadly routine Ukraine update, day 602. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has confirmed that Kyiv used US-provided long-range army tactical missile systems, or otherwise known as ATACMS missiles. The first officially confirmed use in Ukraine of these, which can fly up to 305 kilometres. Kyiv's military has said Ukrainian forces struck airfields near the eastern city of Luhansk and the southern city of Berdyansk in Russian-held territory in eastern and southern Ukraine overnight, destroying helicopters, knocking out an air defence missile launcher and damaging runways. A telecommunication cable connecting Sweden and Estonia has been damaged, Sweden's civil defence minister has said. Carl Oskar Bolin said it appeared to have occurred at the same time as a subsea gas pipeline and a telecom cable connecting Finland and Estonia were damaged on the 8th of October. China's President Xi Jinping welcomed Vladimir Putin, along with representatives from 130 countries, to Beijing for a forum on Xi's Belt and Road Initiative. The lower house of the Russian parliament is reported to have given preliminary approval to a bill revoking the ratification of a global nuclear test ban treaty. The destruction of the Kakova Dam in southeastern Ukraine in June caused $14 billion worth of damage and losses, according to a report by the Ukrainian government and the UN. UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps is due to visit the US for urgent talks over conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. Canada is targeting 9 individuals and 6 TV stations in new sanctions against Russian collaborators in Moldova. The Canadian Foreign Ministry said the individuals targeted are associated with influential oligarchs such as Vladimir Platunik and Ilan Mironovich, and the TV stations are accused of promoting and disseminating Russian disinformation. US, South Korean, and Japanese officials have met in Jakarta to discuss North Korea's engagement with Russia, including arms transfers violating UN Security Council resolutions. A convoy of ambulances from the UK has arrived in Lviv in western Ukraine and will be delivered to hospitals on the front line. 5 vehicles donated by the charity Medical Lifelines Ukraine are being sent to the southern city of Kherson, which is under intense Russian attack, as well as the towns of Kupiansk and Vohorba in the war-torn northeast of the country. The group has donated 43 vehicles since last year's full-scale invasion. So, John, I'm just going to ask you. Usually, I would let you choose what you maybe wanted to pick out there, but I'm intrigued to find out what you think about Grant Shapps going to America to discuss the Ukraine.
Well, I mean, Grant Shapps, I'm reminded of the video that's going around on social media of Grant Shapps and another Tory minister giggling like schoolboys behind Rishi Sunak as he gives an update on the situation in Gaza, showing the kind of stupid wee boys we have at the top of our government. I'm I think it's not surprising, the Conservatives would align themselves in an unquestioning way with American foreign policy, and it looks as if Labour will do the same. Um, I think it's commendable that Broadcasting Scotland continues to cover the Iraq War. Audiences for BBC News or ITV News or the main newspapers would be forgiven for thinking that the Iraq War was over. Sorry, that the Ukraine War was over, as the media gaze turns in its usual kind of obsessive way from one topic to another, and suddenly it's all Gaza and it's not Ukraine anymore. So um, I mean, interesting, the Ukraine war continues with all of the same intensity. I don't know enough to say where it's going. I think it's a war that's going to take a bit longer to resolve. But what's happening in Israel Palestine must have an impact, I think, and unfortunately, maybe a negative impact for Ukraine that they may have to do a deal. I think as the Western powers turn their attention to this new situation, and I think inevitably support in home nations, in particular the US and parts of Europe, for Ukraine weakens.
Yes, thank you for that compliment about broadcasting Scotland. I think it's true. And also thank you for linking that question to that footage. Yes, I've seen it online, and it is quite something. So I'll move on to our next item. Yesterday evening, Gaza's health ministry said in a statement that 471 Palestinians were killed and more than 314 wounded at the Al-Ali Arab hospital in the north of the Gaza Strip. Palestinian officials blamed an Israeli airstrike for the blast. Israel said it was caused by a failed rocket launch from inside Gaza by Islamic Jihad. The Israel Defense Forces spokesperson denied Israeli culpability. He produced what Israel claimed was evidence of an Islamic Jihad rocket with aerial imagery, which Israel claims shows the blast could not have been caused by the IDF fire. He said radar system tracked rockets fired by terrorists from within Gaza at the time of the explosion. Islamic Jihad have denied responsibility. President Biden said that Pentagon intelligence suggests that the devastating explosion at a hospital in Gaza on Tuesday night was caused by the other team and not an Israeli airstrike. Before leaving Israel, Biden cautioned Israelis not to be consumed by rage and said the vast majority of Palestinians were not affiliated with Hamas. He said that the Palestinian people are suffering as well. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has condemned the attack on the hospital in Gaza as senseless and horrifying, while the EU's chief diplomat, Josep Borrell, reiterated the strong need for Europe to condemn Hamas, but also to condemn any attack on civilians by Israel that breaches international humanitarian law. On Tuesday, the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, or UNRWA, said an Israeli airstrike had killed at least 6 people after hitting one of its schools that has been functioning as a shelter for displaced people. Several hospitals in Gaza have become refugees for hundreds of people hoping to be spared bombardment. Palestinian officials reported that Israeli forces shot dead 2 Palestinian teenagers near Ramallah in the West Bank on Wednesday after protests against Israel's bombing of the Gaza Strip. French Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne has said that the number of French citizens killed in the attacks by Hamas in Israel has risen to 24. The US has issued new terrorism-related sanctions targeting 9 individuals and 1 entity linked to Hamas. Turkey has said again that it is in talks with Hamas to secure the release of hostages it seized in Israel and took to Gaza. Israel has said it has identified 199 hostages. The hostages include the elderly, women and children. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi said on Wednesday that Egyptians in their millions would reject the forced displacement of Palestinians into Sinai. Pope Francis has deplored the desperate situation in Gaza as he urged the faithful to take only one side in the Israel-Hamas conflict, the side of peace. Health authorities in Gaza say at least 3,000 people, including 940 children and 1,032 women, have been killed in Israel's bombardment since the 7th of October. Hamas's attack on the 7th of October in southern Israel killed more than 1,400 people, mostly civilians, and saw some 200 taken captive into Gaza. John, I don't know if you probably have been aware that this hospital that was bombed and was initially Israel accused Hamas of bombing one of their own hospitals in Gaza. And now it seems that the opposite is true and that it was Israel that bombed it. Did anybody seriously think that Hamas would bomb their own hospitals?
It seems unlikely they would deliberately do so. I'm clearly none of us is in a position in the fog of war that we see just now to actually say anything with any confidence about what happened here. I mean, it could have been a mistake by the Israelis. I don't think the Israelis would deliberately attack a hospital in the south of Gaza, having indicated that people should move to the south of Gaza. I mean, yeah. So even with the most negative interpretations of the the aims of the Israeli government here, I don't think it's likely they would deliberately have done it. That doesn't mean they couldn't have accidentally done it, of course. Equally, I mean, what I've been reading suggests that Islamic Jihad, who are clearly a far more scary entity than more like ISIS. Who knows if they fired? I mean, I've seen suggestions they fired rockets from a cemetery just at the back of the hospital. But it can be resolved. Fragments of the rocket, or fragments of whichever munition was used to destroy that part of that hospital, fragments can be quickly, I would have thought, identified and linked to either Israeli munitions or to the rockets that are produced in Palestine. But I don't think that's going to happen easily. So no doubt it'll be some time before we find out. Either way, the damage is done. The damage is done. I mean, throughout the Arab world, no one will tell them that this was not an Israeli assault. So, I mean, huge amount of damage is done, and the situation escalates in a frightening way. I mean, it's just horrific. This is a kind of civil war, isn't it? I mean, and civil wars, as we know throughout history, have been the worst. I've probably wondered a bit here, and I don't know what I'm going to say in conclusion. I can't.
Yeah, fair enough. Yes, there is no conclusion, I suppose. So there's a Twitter account called Going Underground, which apparently is Netanyahu's online social media team. And they initially tweeted that Hamas had bombed the Gazan hospital. They've since had to delete that tweet and apologise and admit that it was Israel that had done it. And I've got another tweet here which has been deleted. It was put out by the Twitter account, the official Twitter account of the Prime Minister of Israel. And it said, "This is a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of jungle." But we're running out of time. There's just one thing that I was maybe going to want to ask you is about the difference, as you're a media expert. Apparently there's a difference between how the West reported Biden's meeting with Netanyahu. It's often seen as an act of statesmanship. You know, they're both photographed together with their national flags alongside and wearing nice suits. But apparently in the Middle East, it would be interpreted as a pair of war criminals meeting in private to work out how to whitewash a massacre. Do you know anything about that kind of distinction or between Western and Middle Eastern media interpretations?
Well, you know, well, I was about to say interesting there, but I mean, not everybody was interested. But when I first started to publish research into media coverage, the very first thing I did was about the Western coverage of the Iraq War, you know, of the shock and awe campaign, and contrasted that with reporting in other parts of the world. And even the most liberal of Western media outlets, such as the Guardian or the Sunday Herald at the time, which is fairly liberal, they still had an underlying predisposition not to use Arab voices, but to present everything from the perspective of the West. So that's, you know, and the great confusion here is that people think this is reality, whereas it's a construction of reality that's being presented to them. So I wouldn't be surprised, of course. I mean, I haven't done the research myself. Wouldn't be surprised if the coverage in the West is not predisposing towards support for Israel rather than support for the Palestinians, and to demonising the Palestinians, if even inadvertently, through references to the groups like Islamic Jihad.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. So I'll move on to our next item. Stephen Flynn MP has called for the UK government to support an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the region to protect innocent civilians, women and children. At Prime Minister's questions, the SNP Westminster leader called for a ceasefire to enable the creation of safe corridors out of Gaza for innocent civilians and for safe corridors into Gaza for food, water, medical and humanitarian supplies. Stephen Flynn, MP, also called for the UK government to establish a refugee settlement scheme akin to the previous schemes for Ukraine, Syria and Afghanistan, for which the Scottish government has already confirmed Scotland will play a leading role in the resettling of refugees. Commenting after PMQs, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn said, "We must all continue to unequivocally condemn the abhorrent terrorist attack on the Jewish people and Israeli state and fully support the defeat of Hamas and the return of hostages. But we must also ensure that innocent civilians, women and children are protected and that the Palestinian people are not collectively punished for the actions of a terrorist group. It is essential that the UK government now backs an immediate ceasefire in the region to allow for the creation of humanitarian corridors so that innocent civilians can leave and so that food, water, medicine and humanitarian supplies can enter." He went on to say, "I also reiterate our call for a UK government and international resettlement scheme, which the Scottish government has already made clear Scotland will play a leading role in supporting, so that innocent refugees in the region can find safety and sanctuary." So, John, this comes after the First Minister's speech yesterday, where he spoke movingly about the situation in Palestine and Israel, and made a call to say that he wants asylum seekers from that region to be able to come to Scotland for security. I don't know if you actually managed to catch FMQs today, and if you heard the Prime Minister's reply to Stephen Flynn, but basically it just went along the lines of that. He said something about being proud and funding and funding and funding and aid and working closely with allies. So he didn't really answer the question, and I haven't really got one for you, but I don't know. I'll let you say something because I'm talking too much just now. What do you
Well,
think?
yeah, I mean, I'm aware of the comments that Stephen Flynn made, and as you've pointed out, they largely reiterate what the First Minister said the day before. The First Minister, I think, made some very impressive contributions to the debate about what's happening. Perhaps, perhaps prompted by his own personal experience, deeply distressing personal experience. But he was praised by the prominent writer William Dalrymple, who's I've read several books by William Dalrymple. He's often described as a travel writer, but he's so much more. And he pointed out that the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, is the only politician really in the West who comes out of this with any kind of reputation as somebody who sees both sides of the argument, who sees to the core of the problem, and who cares about the most important things, which is the saving of lives. And and that the call for a corridor and for various other schemes to protect the people, I think is something that Yousaf and others in the SNP are to be praised for, because the only way out of this, is to take a breath, and I have to say, unlike the Labour and Conservative leaders, not join in with the chorus of support for war crimes, which is basically what Keir Starmer was accepting, that Israel is entitled to defend itself. Israel is entitled to commit a war crime by ethnic cleansing and blockading and denying access to water and to food. I mean, it's disgusting, really. And yet, not enough people really, and not enough media coverage has exposed Starmer and others for that.
It's worth noting as well that the Prime Minister, when he answered Stephen Flynn's question, he didn't take the opportunity to say that both Israel and Palestine have a right to defend themselves, and he made no acknowledgement of the suffering of Palestinians. Again, in stark contrast to the First Minister yesterday, who condemned violence on both sides and said that there should be no Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. But
Most, sorry to interrupt, but
go.
I think most people in the UK and in Scotland too don't know the history of what has happened here in this last 80 years, and that that Palestine used to be all Palestine with some very small Jewish settlements, and that after World War II, the British government encouraged the arrival of millions of Jewish people, who gradually took over through war and through illegal purchases took over the land. The Palestinian people, I mean, without in any way wishing to excuse the atrocities they committed, the Palestinian people are like the North American Plains Indians. They're people who commit atrocities because they've been pushed right into a terrible corner here. And I'm reminded of research as far back as the 1970s and 80s by Professor Greg Philo at Glasgow University, the Glasgow Media Group. They showed people in Glasgow in the late 70s, early 80s, people off the street, they showed them videos from BBC news reports about conflict in Palestine, Israel, then, more than 40 years ago. And they discovered that most of the people off the streets in Glasgow think that the Palestinians are recently arrived immigrants causing trouble, and that the Israelis are the original inhabitants. Completely contrary to reality. A classic example of how media construct an alternative reality rather than reflecting the true reality.
Yeah, I've got a couple of notes that I made for the previous item, but didn't actually have time to use. But I'll share them with you now. So the State of Israel was founded in 1948, and apparently that foundation of that state sparked the Arab-Israeli War, and that resulted in the expulsion of Palestinians. And then there was the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And I don't think I realised that Israel had made so many land grabs from so many different neighbours. But which makes me wonder if it's going to spread, this conflict. But we're getting ahead of ourselves and running out of time, so I'd better move on. Thank you, John. UK inflation in September remained at 6.7% as soaring fuel costs offset the first monthly fall in food prices for 2 years to maintain pressure on households amid the cost of living crisis. The Office for National Statistics said the annual inflation rate, as measured by the Consumer Prices Index, remained unchanged from August's reading, raising questions over the Bank of England's next decision on interest rates in November. City economists had forecast a modest fall to 6.6%. Food and non-alcoholic drink prices fell by 0.2% on the month. That's the first monthly decline since September 2021. That was helped by the fierce competition among supermarkets, driving down prices for milk, cheese and eggs, as well as mineral water, soft drinks and juices. However, prices remain significantly higher than a year ago, with the cost of an average food shop still up by more than 12% on an annual basis. Highlighting the pressure on households, the Office for National Statistics said a surge in petrol and diesel prices contributed to almost all of the upward pressure on the inflation rate amid a sharp rise in global oil costs over recent months. Commenting, the SNP's economy spokesperson, Drew Hendry MP, said, "The Tories' mismanagement of the economy is directly responsible for the dire situation we are in, where far too many people are having to make the desperate choice between heating and eating." He went on to say, after 13 years of Tory austerity and a disastrous mini-budget last year, the UK's economy has been plunged into chaos. The Chancellor can make all the excuses he wants, but the reality is that while Scotland is still tied to Westminster and their dodgy economic plans, Scots will continue to feel the effects in their wallets and bank accounts. So, sorry, John. The SNP is committed to creating... the SNP have said that they're committed to creating a strong economy that works for everyone by freezing council taxes to address the cost of living crisis. But it was clear that neither of the Westminster parties are offering the same kind of change that Scotland needs, which is showing why independence is essential to building a fairer and wealthier future. Would you agree?
Well, I would agree. I did notice today that I think, I say today, I think it was an old report that Keir Starmer at one point recently has suggested that the Labour Party would freeze council tax in an effort to help. But now, of course, because the SNP have announced at their conference this desire to freeze council tax, it has to become a bad story. And it's been quickly flipped on its head, and suggestions that it's by people in a variety of journalistic roles suggesting that it's not a progressive move by the SNP. It's a cynical vote-winning move. I wouldn't question, of course, that politicians would make cynical vote-winning moves, but I think research shows, the research by the I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies, in when the early days of the Conservative Party's council tax freeze in England and Wales, and that showed that actually middle earning it's not something that just benefits the rich. I mean, some people will argue, well, you freeze council tax, that means, of course, people who pay a lot of council tax will benefit, and clearly they do. I mean, it's a blunt tool, but the research by the IF showed that middle earners and the very poor actually benefit most from a council tax freeze. So, contrary to media reporting, it has elements of progression within it.
Interesting, thank you. Just by the way, I found a reference to the First Minister back in July when he said in a tweet, if you look at many European countries of Scotland's size, they are wealthier than the UK, have higher productivity and lower levels of poverty. They're also all independent nations. The question is, why not Scotland? So it seems that he could, see it coming in advance. But time's against,
Yes,
sorry, time's against us.
I'd agree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on. A review by a senior lawyer into the procurement of the delayed Ferguson marine ferries found no evidence of fraud, though parts of the process were not entirely satisfactory. The review followed a BBC Disclosure documentary last year, which had alleged the process for awarding the contract may have been rigged in favour of the Port Glasgow shipyard. The documentary claimed Ferguson Marine had been given sight of a document detailing the design specification by a consultant, some of which was copied into the yard's bid, while competitors had to submit a bid with the aid of a less detailed dossier. The BBC said the review failed to tackle the core allegations in the film. Following the documentary, CMAL, that's the Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, instructed Barry Smith KC to investigate the award of the contract. His report, which was published in full today, concluded that ultimately the question posed was whether a fraud was committed during the procurement process. I did not find evidence of fraud. Mr. Smith's investigation did not specifically look into whether procurement rules had been breached. Instead, it considered whether the fraud had taken place. Mr. Smith's report said he doubted whether Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited's possession of a document called a Statement of Technical... Sorry, I'll read that again. Mr. Smith's report said he doubted whether Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited's possession of a document called the Statement of Technical Requirements gave it an advantage. He said it is superficially attractive to conclude that the FMEL gained an advantage in the procurement process by having possession of the document, but closer analysis of the process seems to me to cast doubt on that conclusion. Kevin Hobbs, Chief Executive of CMAL, said, "We welcome the findings of Barry Smith KC's independent investigation, which has established no evidence of fraud in the procurement of vessels 801 and 802. The BBC declined to take part in this review, claiming that Mr. Smith's terms of reference were too narrow. John, I noticed that you've actually got a blog post about this on Talking Up Scotland too. So what would you think about this report?
Well, I think it's not surprising that that's the outcome, and we'll see similar outcomes, I'm sure, with regard to the investigations into the First Minister and the Chief Executive of the SNP. The damage has been done, I suppose, and that's the intention, of course, in stirring up these complaints. Not at all surprised, but of course, the media enthusiasm, the feeding frenzy on ferries that we've seen over the last couple of years, will of course will not be kind of spread into this particular case. I noticed that the Herald, for example, which describes one of its journalists as the leading journalist on ferries, meaning that he's a leading journalist on finding fault with ferry systems, without ever making international comparisons to give credibility to his studies. I noticed that he hasn't reported in this story. They've passed it to some junior reporter whose name I don't recognise. It's just also typical that media are concerned with scare stories, with allegations of fraud and crime and so on, and they get away with it long enough, and then when they're exposed as having made it up and exaggerated it, they just turn the other way and ignore the evidence.
Thank you, John. And there's a classic tweet from MSM Monitor about this story, and it says, "What's this tucked away in fifth spot on the BBC Scotland website? Oh, the rigged smear BBC Scotland created has been found to have been baseless." So, does that surprise you about the BBC Scotland website?
No, no, not entirely. Although I have to say that the Herald has been carrying this one with greater enthusiasm. They have a newsletter specifically about ferries. Although when you click on the link, you see lots of stories about other things rather than ferries. It's a rather kind of shoddily run thing. But one of their senior reporters, Martin Williams, who I refer to as Maritime Williams, has had I don't know how many stories about corruption in the production of the new ferries and incompetence in the ferry system. And I've been in my blog reacting to these. I don't know to what extent the Herald is aware of my reactions, probably not, showing that the Calmac may actually be demonstrably one of the better, maybe the best ferry system of its type, archipelago-based ferry system in the world. I think I've revealed with clear evidence, the Washington State ferries and British Caledonian ferries on the Pacific coast are in far deeper trouble than Calmac is, and are more reliable. Calmac is more reliable, cheaper, and goes to more places, to smaller communities. So this is a classic example of this business of the construction of reality. Most people in Scotland will probably have been taken in by the media coverage and thinking Calmac is doing a bad job, based on a few stories here and there and with no context. And when you look at ferry systems across the globe and start to make comparisons on objective criteria, such as timekeeping, cost, subsidised by subsidies from government and so on, you discover that maybe that's not real. Maybe the world is quite different. Maybe Calmac is actually very good.
Yeah, and you spring to mind a news report, I think it was by BBC Scotland, where they were reporting on ferry failures with a stretch of water behind them, something like the Clyde estuary. And just as they were saying there's no ferries, and the ferries are a big giant ferry glid into view behind her. And but yeah,
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
it's a nice one. Better move on. I'm sorry.
golden moment.
Andrew Cooper, the Conservative candidate in the Tamworth by-election, has defended sharing a Facebook post telling jobless parents who cannot field their children to F off if they still pay a £30 phone bill. Cooper is seeking to replace the former Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher as MP for Tamworth in one of two by-elections on Thursday, tomorrow. He shared a photo on social media that indicated people should only seek help if they were employed and gave up their TV and mobile phone contracts. The post, shared in 2020, asked the question, "Can you feed your kids?" The diagram suggests those who are out of work, pay for TV, Sky, British Telecom, etc., or have a phone contract for plus £30, should F off rather than seek help. Rishi Sunak refused to condemn Cooper's comments at Prime Minister's questions, saying he was proud of the government's record on supporting families during the cost of living crisis. In a statement, Cooper said, "I think most people in Tamworth would agree that benefits are not there to pay for luxuries. There are too many people on out-of-work benefits, and there needs to be improved incentives to get people into work." In Tamworth, 19.5% of children lived in relative poverty as of 2021-22, according to the latest constituency data. Tamworth was held by Labour after a huge by-election victory for the party in 1996, but Pincher won the seat for the Conservatives in 2010 and almost doubled his majority to nearly 20,000 at the 2019 general election. On the same day, the party also faces a three-way fight with the Liberal Democrats for Nadine Dorries' seat in Mid-Bedfordshire. Labour is hoping to flip both Tory majorities. So, John, Nadine Dorries' majority, by the way, is something like 20,000 in Mid-Bedfordshire. And there's a memo to Greg Hands that's been leaked outlining that there's concerns that the party's vote share could fall by half in both Tamworth and in Mid-Bedfordshire, which would end in the loss of both seats. But this item is really about poverty. So It was Labour MP Karen Smith who asked the Prime Minister at PMQs if he would condemn the comments, and he didn't. He just went on to say how proud he was of how the party was helping people in the cost of living crisis. And he almost seemed to imply that, unlike Labour, the Tories are the party that believes in work. So again, I'm speaking too much. I better let you contribute. What have you got to say for this one?
Well, it's just a classic, isn't it, of something you might have thought would have faded historically. This confusion that some people have in the early part of the 21st century that the unemployed should be absolutely poor rather than relatively poor. The idea being that if you're unemployed, you shouldn't be able to have anything at all in your life beyond food and maybe heating for your house. Um, it's an incredibly old-fashioned idea. It's a Victorian idea, and I know the Victorians are popular amongst the Conservatives. But it's just an astonishing attitude that people who are unemployed should have nothing, nothing at all. This from a man who will be earning at least 85,000 a year, will no doubt have other sources of income based on his connections, and claiming expenses of horrendous level for the most basic of items, no doubt, claiming for staples, no doubt, on his expenses. Yeah, I mean, so oh, sorry, I'm forgetting he's not elected yet, of course, but were he elected, then like typical Conservative MPs, he'd be living a very kind of comfortable life. It's just heartbreaking.
Yes, thanks, John. And the voice in our ear, which people at home can't hear, is telling us that you need things like telephones and internet to be able to apply for benefits and the like. So it's an interesting one. I'll move on to our next item. The Royal Society for Chemistry, the RSC, has told the UK government that acceptable levels of forever chemicals in drinking water in England should be reduced tenfold and a new national chemical agency created to protect public health. The chartered body wants to see a reduction in the cap on levels of the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAs, in tap water. PFAs are a family of about 10,000 widely used chemicals that do not break down easily in the environment. Some have been linked to cancers, liver and thyroid disease, immune and fertility problems, and developmental defects in unborn children. The current limit for drinking water in England, which is a guideline and not a statutory cap, is 100 nanograms a litre for individual PFAs, and the RSC wants this reduced to 10 nanograms per litre, and a new overall limit introduced of 100 nanograms per litre for a wide range of PFAs in drinking water. Cutting the limit would bring the UK into closer alignment with the EU's stricter limit of 100 nanograms per litre for the sum of 20 specific PFAs and 500 nanograms per litre for total PFAs in drinking water. The Scottish Government introduced new regulations at the beginning of this year, which updated standards in Scotland to meet those set by the World Health Organization that limit emerging pollutants and endocrine disrupting compounds. Such pollutants include PFAs, also known as forever chemicals, and are commonly used in non-stick and water repellent products and do not degrade when they reach the environment. These regulations keep Scotland in line with the EU, in contrast to the approach being taken by the UK government. So, John, just another wee bit of background information. England has the only fully privatised water system in Europe and the most water pollution and the most expensive water. Some cities in America have privatised water companies, but not the entire USA. And the only other country that has a privatised water system is apparently Chile, and that was brought in by Pinochet. But what do you think about this difference between Scotland and England's water companies and how one is staying aligned with the EU while the other one isn't?
Well, it's a very stark contrast, isn't it, between the two? And we've seen horrific stories from south of the border about pollution and about the massive expenditure, of course, on chief executive salaries. I think it's prompted our media, of course, to try and find something negative they can say about the water and sewerage system in Scotland. But I don't think there's any contrast between the two.
Thank you, John. So Forgive us, viewers. The voice in our ear is asking us to concentrate more on chemicals, but I've also got my eye on the time. So it's there's a lot of things that are in the food chain now. You, yes, if you would you let could you please let us discuss it? So it's these chemicals are in the food chain, they're in the water, and but it is not. It's also plastics. There's been recent research that talk about plastic degrading over time, but apparently it doesn't. Apparently it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller particles until they're invisible to the human eye, and it doesn't go away. It's just becoming more and more difficult to find or to notice. But is there anything else, do you think, that England should be doing to keep these terrifying chemicals out of their water system, as well as human effluent, of course?
Yeah, I mean, this is also not an area in which I have any expertise at all. I mean, I've been monitoring the situation just like any concerned citizen would, and when I do understand that these chemicals are well, more than quite disturbing, they're very disturbing. But there's just so much, there's just so much that you could be aware of and concerned about. I must admit, I haven't been spending a lot of time thinking about that. Um, it's just clearly we need to have a kind of government which focuses on the protection of the population rather than just on the protection of business.
Thank you, John. Next item is Scotianomics. The wellbeing think tank has published a new report on measuring the wellbeing economy, titled Defining and Quantifying the Wellbeing Economic Approach. This report sets out a plan for implementing a wellbeing economy using the wellbeing economic approach and describes how its success can be measured by policymakers. The report outlines the need to move toward a new economic system which will lead to a happier, healthier, wealthier and more prosperous nation. A wellbeing economy shifts government, businesses and individuals away from focusing only on GDP growth as the dominant measure of economic success. Scotianomics say the best way to achieve this is through the wellbeing economic approach, which treats quality of life, equality, fairness, happiness and health as economic outcomes that should be given equal weight in decision making as GDP growth. In the report, Scotianomics devises the Scotianomics Wellbeing Economy Index 2023. The index measures countries across 5 dimensions that make up the wellbeing economic approach: economy, human development, living environment, community, and future-proofing. The submeasures for each of these dimensions account for the complexity of measuring an economy based on well-being, which, when added together, represents an overall score. This allows for easy comparison between nations and for policymakers to quickly understand in which area their nation needs improvement or strengthening. The UK places only 16th out of 33 nations on the 2023 Scotianomics Wellbeing Index, with the top 5 places being taken by Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Denmark and Finland, all northern European nations with a similar population and size to Scotland. Scotianomics hopes that this report can be the first in a series of many that provide both analysis and policymakers with the tools to understand and implement policies based on improving well-being for all. Scotianomics chief economist Gordon McIntyre Kemp said, "Our economic system is broken. The economic ideas from last century offer no solution to the problems of this century, especially the climate crisis and the coming impact of AI and robotics on the labour market. We need to press the reset button. Tinkering with the restrictions of the current economic system will achieve nothing. We require a paradigm shift and a system change." He went on to say, the wellbeing economic approach is that system change. The wellbeing economic approach is that system change. The prime measure of the neoliberal economy is GDP, despite its inadequacies and built-in negative outcomes for people on the planet. The Scotianomics Wellbeing Economy Index shows how we can start to create a measurement system that places wellbeing metrics such as quality of life, equality, fairness, happiness and health as economic outcomes that should be given equal weight at the very least to economic growth. So John, the top 5 countries in that report all had a similar population to Scotland and size. What do you think that tells us?
Well, it tells us that when you measure things correctly, that countries of a certain size seem to do better, and that's not surprising, I think, because they tend to be more democratic and they can hold to account their governments, and they can, I think, also hold to account the corporations that impinge on their lives. I mean, no credible economics academic, to my knowledge, makes much use of GDP anymore. I don't think the IMF are particularly interested in GDP. It's only of use, really, to my mind, to certain politicians who want to use it for political purposes, and in the context of Scotland, who want to use it as the basis for a case against Scottish independence. There have been earlier attempts. I mean, I welcome this development, this well-being economy approach that's been done. It's been done in the past, and I seem to remember a study some way back, a study in the 1990s, which said when you measure more broadly, because, for example, GDP can actually go up as the lives of the majority worsen. That's possible because GDP doesn't measure as it should more widely. That I think it said that in terms of the more wide experience of the population, including, access to free health care for all the population, access to good housing at low cost, access to free university tuition, and so on. That was improving in Britain from 1945 right up till it peaked in 1976. And from 1976 onwards, we've been in decline. The quality of life, the well-being economy, if you want to call it that, has been declining ever since under the stewardship of the Conservatives and New Labour, and GDP is essentially a political tool.
Thank you, John. So these politicians that you said were resisting using a well-being economy to work out how well or badly your country's doing, how it's faring in international standards, would they tend to be politicians that are more concerned about shareholders' profits and the like?
Of course, because I mean, as I said, that circumstances for that particular community, for those who own or for those who have shares in corporations, things can actually get much better for them, just as things are getting far worse for everybody else.
That's great. Thank you, John. So the next item is Energy Minister Gillian Martin will tell the world's largest Arctic conference that Scotland can help power its northern neighbours' journey to net zero. During meetings at the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, Iceland, the Minister will be highlighting Scotland's expertise in renewable energy and seek to strengthen international partnerships in delivering technologies like green hydrogen and offshore wind. The Assembly takes place from the 19th to the 21st of October and will be attended by ministers, diplomats and academics from countries including Sweden, Norway, the US and Canada. Ms Martin will also meet the president of next month's COP28 UN Climate Change Summit in the United Arab Emirates. That's Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, as well as other senior decision makers. During her 3-day visit, the Minister is also meeting the Icelandic Parliament's Environment and Communications Committee, National Energy Authority Director General Hala Harund Logendóttir, Nordic Council of Ministers Secretary General Karen Elleman, Alaska's US Senator Lisa Murkowski, the Swedish Environment Minister Romina Pourmokhtari, the UAE Climate Change and Environment Minister Mariam Al-Airi, Belgium's Environment Minister Zakia Katabi, Iceland's Environment, Energy and Climate Minister. I'm really sorry, I'm not going to try to pronounce that name because I will get it wrong, forgive me. The Energy Minister said, as the most northerly non-Arctic nation, Scotland is ideally placed to connect with the European Arctic with Central Europe and bridge the North Sea and North Atlantic. We have the resources, skills and ambition to lead from the front in advancing green energy technologies and accelerating decarbonisation across our shared neighbourhood. She went on to say, we have a massive potential pipeline of offshore wind projects, which is the equivalent of producing enough electricity annually to power every home in Scotland for 17 years. Scotland is also the most advanced hub in Europe for marine energy and is home to some of the world's first, largest and most advanced tidal stream deployments. She continued, "We are able to be a leading provider of green energy in the North Atlantic and Arctic region. Achieving energy security while tackling climate change requires a mutual endeavour, and we are ready to play our part." Scotland was the first country to declare a global emergency in 2019 to address the effects of climate change. I look forward to meaningful discussions with the organisers of this year's UN Climate Change Summit on how we create the momentum necessary for worldwide change. So, John, I couldn't help but notice that these Arctic summits featured quite often in your blogs on Talking Up Scotland too. So, is what the Minister said true or accurate?
I think it is, and I think this is a real opportunity for Scotland. And as you pointed out, we're not in the Arctic Circle, but we're right on the edge of it, and we are world leaders in technologies that will be of tremendous interest to the countries in the Arctic Circle. There is, of course, typically virtually no media coverage of this event, just as there wasn't nearly 5 years ago, I think, when Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister at the time, attended the same group on behalf of Scotland, was welcomed, and she pointed on her return to the tremendous opportunities which are being developed here. You know, Scotland's had a history sometimes of being on the edge of things. I think with regard to this, we can be right in the heart of things, and it's something clearly that the Scottish Government, the SNP and government have been doing. I noted in my blog years ago that there were at least 200 incidents where Scottish ministers had attended groups, not just in the Arctic Circle, but also in Northern Europe, where they thought that perhaps they could develop links to counter the losses incurred by Brexit. Again, no media coverage of these. And of course, as we see now, something that will offend the Foreign Office. James cleverly has already tried to slap our wrists over having the cheek to form direct links, trade links with other parts of the world. He wants everything to go through his office. But I think we just tell him to get stuffed and get on with it.
Thank you, John. I was going to mention Mr. Cleverly because aren't these really high-level international summits and meetings the kind of thing that he was saying that Westminster or the Tory government in Westminster should remove civil servant assistance for?
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Yes, it's exactly it. I mean, they've been making a lot of this because they clearly see it as undermining their authority, that and further demonstrating the potential for Scotland of full independence and our welcome in these other parts of the world. It reminds me a little of I don't know if you're aware of the recent developments in Poland, where Donald Tusk looks like winning. Donald Tusk, a real Europhile, and Donald Tusk was famous a few years back, maybe in 2015, saying that Scotland would be enthusiastically received were we to reapply for membership. There are lots of people who have the nerve to say that Scotland wouldn't get easy access back into the EU, despite the fact that we're already aligned through our institutions. He's just one, and I think the reception here in Iceland confirms that Scotland has the potential to be straight back into the EU, and to be, at the heart of developments rather than, strapped to this maniac on the fringes.
Thank you, John. And of course, I'm reminded of a lot of talk at the time of COP26 when it was here in Glasgow, that people, politicians were saying that they wanted to minimise the First Minister's, the then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon's access to that, and that didn't really work very well for them, if I remember rightly. But no. I'll move on to the next item. A PhD researcher at the University of St Andrews studying microbes in the human gut has discovered a new molecule that acts as a distress signal when viruses are detected. The discovery paves the way to a new class of bioactive molecules that could lead to drugs with applications in human health and antimicrobial therapy. The community of microbes that inhabit the human body is known as the microbiome. The health of the microbiome is crucial to our own well-being. Just like us, microbes are often infected by viruses, and just like us, they have immune systems to prevent viruses running amok in the population. Hiyoshi and Chi from the School of Biology discovered a new molecule, SAM-AMP, previously unknown to science, which is made by joining two of the most widespread chemicals present in all living things, SAM and ATP, in a completely new way, forgive me. Once again, once made, SAM-AMP causes pores in the cell surface to open, making cells leaky. This can lead to altruistic suicide of infected cells to protect neighbours from infection, a type of defence also seen in human cells. Hiyoshi and Chi identified SAM-AMP while trying to understand how the cell's defence system worked, as it was new to science. This involved a lot of perseverance and detective work using a technique known as mass spectrometry to break the molecule into tiny pieces and then identifying all the parts. She said, the existence of SAM-AMP was completely unexpected, showing us there is much we still don't understand about bacterial immune systems. Professor Malcolm White, who led the research, said, as viruses are constantly infecting bacteria, SAM-AMP is being made in all of us every day. It will be fascinating to explore how it affects bacteria and whether our own cells can sense this distress signal too. Now that we know how to make this molecule, we can manipulate the component parts to generate a whole family of novel compounds with potential applications in biomedicine. John, I'm just wondering if this is one of the reasons why St Andrews was recently nominated the best university in the UK, beating both Oxford and Cambridge. Do you think that might be connected?
Hey, well, as I understand it, I don't know the full story. As I understand it, St Andrews were top in terms of student evaluation rather than research activity. But I mean, I don't know enough about this anymore. I'm kind of detached from the whole thing. I used to be quite interested in it. But I think it's got, St Andrews' reputation has got a lot to do with the fact that they're wealthy enough to have quite small classes and students like that. And so I think they got a lot of their positive reports on the basis of that. But clearly they must be leading in research as well. Needless to say, you're in an area there where I know less than zero about my knowledge is microscopic on this particular issue. So it sounds like a good thing, and well done to St Andrews.
Yeah, so it almost reads like science fiction or something, doesn't it? Or sort of space age technology.
Well,
It really
yeah.
is. Yeah, and I'm guessing it could go on to become something like the discovery of penicillin. Do you
Ah,
think? Yeah.
what, again, yes, if you say so.
Whackens, I
Good.
suppose, is what they'll say. Well, again, thank you, John, for sparing part of your weekday evening. Really appreciate it, and I hope
Pleasure.
you come back again soon. So that's it for this evening. But before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, your generosity has given us a little more time. We have now raised over £19,200 and we're able to continue making programmes with that for the next few weeks. But we need to raise the remaining £10,800 really urgently. But meanwhile, we'll say good night and thank you for watching.